You know, when a major power uses military force, the attack itself is really just the opening scene. The real story, the one with all the twists and turns, is how the rest of the world reacts. Today, we're going to break down a hypothetical, but super instructive event, a U.S. intervention in Venezuela and the massive international fallout. Let's really dig into those ripple effects.
Okay, here's how we're going to tackle this in 5 simple parts. First, we'll get clear on what actually happened. Then, we'll look at how the world basically split in two. After that, we'll dive into the tricky legal problems, zoom in on the view from Latin America, and finally, we'll talk about the real-world costs of it all.
All right, part 1. First things first. Before we can get into why everyone was so divided, we have to be absolutely crystal clear on the what. Let's just lay out the basic facts.
So I want you to picture this. The date is January 3rd, 2026, and the eyes of the entire world are locked on Venezuela. This is the moment it all kicks off. So what went down? Let's just stick to the bare-bones facts, right from the source material. Okay, first off, the United States launched military strikes. The stated target? Venezuelan government infrastructure. And the end result of that action was the capture of the country's president, Nicolás Maduro. That's it. Just the core events, plain and simple.
Okay, so now that we have the facts straight, we can move on to part 2, the global reaction. And as you can probably guess, when something this big happens, the world doesn't exactly speak with one voice. It pretty much fractured.
So how did the world respond? Well, it wasn't a simple yes or no. The reactions pretty much sorted themselves into 4 different buckets. You had the countries that flat out condemned it as illegal. Then you had a group that was more cautious, calling for everyone to calm down and look at the law. A third group actually supported the action. And of course, you had some countries that just stayed neutral, watching from the sidelines.
Let's start with that first group, the ones who condemned it. For them, this wasn't just a political disagreement. It was about the law. Their core message, if you boil down their statements, was that this was a flagrant violation of everything international law stands for, especially a nation's right to run its own affairs.
And then you have the complete opposite take, the supporters. They weren't looking at this through a legal lens. For them, it was all about ideology. They saw it as a necessary action, something that had to be done to restore democracy. It's pretty wild, right? The exact same event, seen through 2 totally different worldviews. This huge disagreement is the perfect way to get into part 3. We're diving into the really complicated stuff now, the legal debate, and this really thorny issue of precedent.
Now, to really get a handle on the legal fight here, we have to understand one key concept: state sovereignty. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually simple. It's the principle that a country gets to run its own show, within its own borders, and other countries can't interfere. It's like the bedrock of the entire international system.
And this is where you see the 2 sides just collide. On one side, the critics are pointing to the rulebook, specifically Article 2 of the UN Charter, which basically says you are not allowed to use force against another country, period. But on the other side, the U.S. justification, as reported by Reuters, framed it totally differently, as something that was necessary for democracy or security.
So why does all this legal back and forth matter so much? It all comes down to the fear of setting a precedent. Think about it this way. If one country can do this and get away with it, what's to stop another major power from doing the same thing somewhere else next year? That's the real fear, that this one action could rip up the old rulebook and create a dangerous new normal for everyone.
So while the rest of the world was split, one region was actually pretty unified in its reaction. So for part 4, let's zoom in on the view from Latin America.
Yeah, forget that 4-way split we saw earlier. The nations of Latin America were almost all on the same page. The source material shows a massive regional rejection of military force. Instead, their statements were all about finding diplomatic solutions, talking things out, and holding elections. And the reason? A deep, historically rooted fear that this kind of intervention, no matter the intention, would just set the whole region on fire.
And all of this brings us to our final section. We've looked at the what, the how, and the why of the global reaction. But now we have to ask the most important question of all. So what? Why does any of this really matter? This is the question that cuts through all the noise. It's so easy to get lost in the high-level politics and the legal arguments. But we've got to remember that at the end of the day, actions like these have very real consequences for actual people and their countries.
When you really analyze the reactions, 3 big implications just jump out. First, it's pretty much impossible for a military intervention not to completely disrupt the lives of ordinary civilians.
Second, actions like these can shatter a nation's political future, often leaving a total power vacuum. And third, and this is a tough one, it highlights a stark reality. When major powers use force, it's always the weaker states that pay the heaviest price.
So if we have to boil this whole incredibly complex event down to one key takeaway from the source material, it's this. Military conquest and forced regime change, no matter what justification is given, are almost universally viewed as being destabilizing and incredibly harmful. A powerful and pretty sobering conclusion to a world-shaking event.